Welcome to today's wonderful story that will truly change your perspective on what it means to be intelligent. In the dusty schoolyard of rural Kenya, students crowded shoulder to shoulder under the sun, whispering to each other with curious glances. At the center of it all stood Eric, a scrawny 13-year-old with torn shorts and a sheepish smile, looking as though he'd wandered into the wrong event. Beside him was the Minister of Education, a man of status and influence, hand on Eric's shoulder and eyes full of pride. No one could believe their eyes. Today, the minister announced, his voice booming across the field, "I want to tell you about this young man here, a boy who surprised me, taught me a lesson on what intelligence truly means, and changed my worldview." The entire schoolyard went silent. Teachers shifted uncomfortably. Students blinked in disbelief. Was this really Eric, the same boy they'd written off as hopeless? Let's rewind back to when Eric's story began. Eric was the oldest of 3 kids in a small family of 5. He had a little brother named Evans, a natural-born genius who could recite math tables before he could even tie his shoes, and a sister named Eve who could memorize anything in seconds, impressing teachers with perfect scores on every test. If there was an academic competition, Eve and Evans would win it, probably in their sleep. But Eric was different. He struggled. Math made no sense to him. English was a jumble. And as for science, the only thing he liked was mixing random stuff from the kitchen to see if it would explode. His parents were less than amused. Every time they held family meetings, he'd sit on the couch, barely noticed, while his parents showered praises on Evans and Eve. "Look at Eve, always getting A's," his father would say proudly, giving her a big hug. "And Evans, my boy, a future doctor," he'd exclaim, patting Evans on the back with pride. Then they'd turn to Eric, who sat at the edge of his seat, hoping for a sliver of approval. "Eric," his mother would sigh, shaking her head. "Why can't you be more like them?" Eric would feel his heart sink as he lowered his head. He wished he could be like his siblings, but school felt like a foreign language to him. Numbers swam on the page, words turned into jumbled letters, and his brain seemed to shut down every time a teacher started asking questions. And it wasn't just his family. Teachers were no kinder. Mr. Kamau, the math teacher, was the worst. A tall man with a ruler that seemed to snap on its own. He had a way of looking at Eric like he was an unsolvable equation. Every time Eric failed a test, Mr. Kamau would shake his head dramatically. "Eric," he'd shout, tapping the board with his ruler, "if laziness was a subject, you'd get an A. You're as slow as molasses. At this rate, you'll never amount to anything." The class would burst out laughing, some students even mimicking Eric's blank stares. Every word dug deeper, making Eric feel smaller and smaller. He hated school, he hated math, and worst of all, he hated himself. By the end of every day, he'd drag his feet home, defeated, only to hear more praise for Evans and Eve at the dinner table. He would cry himself to sleep, wishing the world to just end. But Eric had a secret. Every afternoon after school, he'd take a detour to Mike's workshop at the edge of the village. Mike was a grizzled mechanic, with hands that looked like they were carved from the earth. He smelled of engine oil and always had a wrench in his hand, tinkering with some old motorbike or broken-down car. Eric found Mike's world fascinating, and as a kid, he'd linger around the shop, mesmerized by the way machines seemed to come alive under Mike's hands. One day, when Eric was about 10, Mike caught him staring. "Hey boy," he called out. "You want to learn, don't you?" Eric nodded shyly. That day marked the beginning of something magical for him. Eric quickly became Mike's shadow, eagerly learning how engines worked, why certain parts fit together, and how to fix anything from rusty bicycles to beat-up cars. With every broken bolt he replaced, Eric felt a spark of pride, something he never felt at home or in school. Mike never judged him, and for the first time in his life, Eric felt seen. He even started dreaming about becoming a mechanic someday, a real one, just like Mike. But back at school, things only got worse. If you enjoy this story, please like, comment, and subscribe. In Form 2, the Minister of Education announced he would be visiting Eric's high school. Now, this was a big deal. The whole village started buzzing about it, and teachers spent days scrubbing floors, repainting walls, and even planting flowers to impress the minister. But there was one thing the teachers were worried about: Eric. The school principal, Mr. Mwangi, called Eric to his office, his face like thunder. "Eric," he said with forced politeness, "we don't want any, distractions when the minister comes. Perhaps you should stay home that day." Eric felt a knot form in his throat. They didn't even want him around. It hurt, but he didn't argue. He was used to being told he wasn't good enough. On the morning of the visit, Eric took his father's cattle out to graze, staying far from the school. But as he was leading them back home through a rough dirt road that cut through the forest, he noticed something unusual. 3 big, black government cars parked on the road with their hazard lights blinking. Curious, Eric approached and saw a group of men in suits scratching their heads, staring at a smoking engine. He walked closer, trying not to laugh at how these men looked like fish out of water. "Excuse me, boy," one of the suited men called out. "Do you know any mechanics around here? We have tried to call for help, but there is no phone coverage here in the middle of the forest." Eric grinned and cleared his throat. "I'm a mechanic," he said confidently. The minister raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Oh, really? You look a little young. You should even be in school." Eric shrugged. "I work with Mike," he said, hoping that name would be enough. With nothing to lose, they let Eric approach the engine, which was indeed smoking and coughing like it was having a tantrum. He peered inside, spotted a problem with the fuel line, and got to work, tightening a few loose bolts, adjusting a pipe, and tapping here and there with the skill of a pro. The men watched in stunned silence, and in just a few minutes, Eric stood back. "Try it now," he said, crossing his arms. The driver turned the key, and the engine came back to life with a satisfying roar. The minister's eyes widened. "You really did it!" Eric just shrugged again, a small proud smile creeping onto his face. The minister was stunned. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, genuinely curious. When Eric told him about how he'd been sent away from school, the minister frowned. Without another word, he motioned for Eric to get into one of the cars. The entourage continued to the school, this time with Eric in the middle of it all, sitting like a little king in the back seat. When they arrived, the teachers' faces went pale. They hadn't expected to see Eric back, let alone sitting beside the minister. To them, Eric was always an example of a failure. They knew he was up to something sinister. They stammered apologies and tried to explain, but the minister held up a hand. Turning to the crowd, he called everyone to gather around, and then he put his arm around Eric's shoulders. "This young man just saved us all today," he said to the school, his voice serious. "He fixed our car, something none of us here knew how to do. But he was sent away from school because of his poor performance." He said those words with a touch of anger, and the teachers squirmed. Eric watched, mouth open, as the minister went on. "Intelligence isn't just about exams or tests. Some people are brilliant with books, others with their hands. And in life, we need all kinds of intelligence and skills." The students cheered, and for the first time in his life, Eric felt pride swelling in his chest. That evening, Eric's story hit the local news. His parents watched in shock as the anchor shared how Eric had fixed the minister's car and the lesson the minister had shared with everyone. When Eric got home, his parents hugged him tightly, apologizing through tears for how they'd treated him all those years. With the minister's support, Eric pursued a career in mechanics, later becoming a respected engineer who returned to his village to inspire young minds, just as Mike had inspired him. His life became a testament to the truth that intelligence comes in many forms, and everyone has their unique gifts to offer the world. And so, in that little village, Eric became a legend, the boy who turned wrenches and engines into wisdom, teaching everyone that true success is measured not by grades, but by the strength of the dreams you follow. Everyone has unique strengths and forms of intelligence. Just because someone doesn't excel in traditional academics doesn't mean they're not brilliant in other ways. True success often comes from embracing our natural talents and passions, no matter how unconventional they may seem. This story reminds us that everyone has their own path to success, and sometimes the most fulfilling paths are the ones less recognized. Have you ever felt overlooked or underestimated because you didn't fit into a traditional mold? How did that affect your self-esteem or motivation? How do we as a society define intelligence? Are there ways we could broaden that definition to recognize different types of strengths in others? Tell me what you think in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and subscribe. Cheers. Have a good one.